Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We're finally done with our month of reading a book per week, and now we get to jump into our research. And so I just want to start by recounting some of the reading responses. And now, in particular, I want to just take a second to talk about the historiography and the historiographical intervention that we talked about, and you'll see why that's going to be important in a second. We did a really good job identifying this intervention and where she talks about the historiography in particular. And so I want to, for those of you who might have struggled a little bit, I just want to point out that a red flag to tell you that the author is talking about historiography is something like this. And so I'm underlining, thanks to a generation of historical scholarship. So that's a red flag that the author is taking some time to tell you what's been written on a particular subject, right? And she's really interested in how to explain the story of conservative ascendancy since World War II. Okay, and so what she's trying to say here is that I'm going to introduce you now to the traditional story about the ascension of conservatism since World War II. And that's what happens in the next couple of pages here, right? So she says that, the broad contours of that narrative are by now widely familiar, and then here she lays out what that general narrative of conservative ascendancy looks like. And then this is where some people didn't get quite this far. What she does here is she says, this is how my project differs, right? And so the goal of historiography or historiographical intervention is to tell the reader what's been written on a particular subject in the field, and then to lay out what's unique about your particular project. And that's what she does right here with this sentence. The Walmart moms offer another perspective, one that links them directly to America's original populace. Like the rural insurgents of the Old People's Party, they expect government to help citizens like themselves, white, hardworking Christian family members. In the 20th century, their home communities in the South and West flourished through deliberate federal redistribution of resources out of northern Rust Belt into the Sun Belt, entering the wage workforce under the service economy rather than an industrial one. And she goes on to lay this out further, right? And so that's kind of the goal of the historiography. And that's one of the reasons why this is really important, is because we're going to do something like this on a much smaller scale. And so what I want to do is step back here, and we'll get back into the book one more time, is to look at the research projects that you have to choose from. Okay. And so all of these projects, and there are 7 possible projects to choose from, takes a research question from one of the books that we've read, and allows you to investigate that particular question. Okay. And so when we get to our research prospectus, which is I'm going to introduce next week, and when we get to our papers, we know that the author of the book for Project One is Steinberg, right? Did the code of calamity etiquette that began to dominate explanations of natural disasters in the 19th century continue to dominate after 1945? Well, Steinberg provides an answer to that question, right? That's one of his research questions in the book. And you are going to ask that question too in your own research. And so what you're going to do in your own historiography section is to say, this is how Steinberg, okay, this is going to be a much smaller scale. When Morton wrote her book, she's talking about, when she lays out scholarship, she's talking about how, 40 different scholars have written about this. We're going to write about how one scholar has answered this particular question, right? So for Project One, when we get to our research prospectus and our paper, we're going to lay out how Steinberg answered that particular question. And then you're going to talk about how your own research answers that question, whether it supports Steinberg's answer or whether it challenges Steinberg's answer. right? And so let's go through some of these projects, because there's at least one question that relates to every book that we've read so far that you have to choose from, and you're just choosing one of these projects. And that's really the goal for this entire week, is for you to simply choose a project. So we're kind of going on a light week this week, since we've done a lot of work over the past month. Okay, and so this first project, and I just kind of laid out that question. And so for each of these projects, I have a set of rules and advice. Okay, and so for project one, about that code of calamity etiquette. And if you forgot what that was, you just need to go back to Steinberg's book. It's you wrote one of your reading response questions about this code of calamity etiquette. And so rules of advice. So you must look at the response to at least 3 natural disasters after 1945. And so they don't have to be all different types of natural disasters. So for example, if you wanted to look at the response to 3 hurricanes, that's fine, or 3 tornadoes. If you want to mix them up and choose 1 hurricane, 1 tornado, and a flood or something, it really doesn't matter. It just has to be 3 different natural disasters to give you, enough of a sample to be able to really answer this question. And so part of my advice here is to look at some of the worst natural disasters since 1945, because, the most is probably going to be written about the worst disasters. Ones that are smaller aren't going to attract as much national attention. And so an easy way to find, a list of the costliest or the worst natural disasters are through just a simple Google search. And then from there, once you've kind of started to gather some names of some big natural disasters, then you can start diving into some research about those disasters. And remember, when Steinberg studies or tries to make this claim about this code of calamity etiquette that emerges, he's mostly looking at newspapers and what's been written about these particular disasters. And so what I want you to is to dive into our library's newspaper databases and start looking at articles about the disasters that you choose to research. And so our library database has a wonderful collection of historical newspapers that you can look at. And I provide a link to the site right here. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. So the link leads you right here into our library website. And here's a list of all of the historical newspaper databases that you have access to. And I'm just going to click on one of these to show you, just to give you a really brief introduction to how to search. Okay, this is taking you into the New York Times database, and it'll force you to sign in with your username and password. And it's slowly going to get there. And here we go. So it gets us into this database called ProQuest, Historical Newspapers. And I'm just going to give you a couple pieces of advice to start, because one of the things I'd like you to do this week is just kind of play around with some of these databases. And next week, we'll really get into getting how to extract some really good information here. And so my one big piece of advice is to go here to this place called publication date, because we don't want to search all dates, all right? And we want to go to a specific date range, all right? And so let's say that you pick a particular natural disaster that happened in, January 1972. We can make sure that our search starts with articles in January 1972, and then you want to figure out how long do we want to search for, right? Do we think we might just limit our search just to a couple of months, assuming that the coverage only lasted a couple of months? It might have lasted longer, right? So we do that search, and then we can just put in something like hurricane and the name. Okay, I'm just going to put hurricane because I don't know the name that you want to search for. Let's see if any hurricanes happened between January and March of 1972. Okay, and we get a bunch of selections here, 49 results, and it'll take us into full text PDF. It'll take us right into the article from the New York Times. Okay, So just start picking out some, if you want to explore this project, start picking out some natural disasters, and go into the newspaper databases and just see what's there this week. And next week we'll get into some more targeted research. All right, going back to our choices of projects, that one of the other common recommendations that I have for a lot of these projects is not just the newspaper database, but also Google has a great collection of magazines that will be helpful for a lot of you depending on what project you choose. And so I'll just show you that as well. Go back to the internet here. The link takes you here to Google Magazines. This search is not as advanced as our library newspaper databases, but it's still a really good resource. And so I'll just show you what maybe Life magazine looks like. Okay. Now, one of the things that's not very intuitive here is when you go into this Google Magazine site, it'll have things like January 2009. And in some ways, it might suggest to you that that's the only issue available, but it's not. And so Life here has December 29, 1972, which I assume is maybe the last issue that it has. But if we go just here to browse all issues, it'll take you to everything, every issue that Google Magazines has available for you to actually look at. You can see it's quite a few. It goes back to, we'll go see how far back it goes for Life magazine. I'm not going to go all the way back, but we're already into the early 1960s here. So if we just go into one of these issues, we can go preview the magazine. Takes us right into Life, and we can start exploring what's in there. And so again, so even for if you're doing a natural disasters project, we know that it happened in December or November 1961. We might go into December's issue and see if there's any coverage of that natural disaster in that particular issue. Lots of different magazines available for you to look at in this collection. So another really useful place, depending on what project you're working on, to just kind of start your research and see what's available. Okay, so project 1 comes from a research question from Steinberg's book. Project 2 comes from a research question from the book on the memory of the civil rights movement, the Theo Harris book that we read. Okay, and so pretty simple research question that's kind of the key question of that entire book, which is, what are the key themes of the popular memory of the civil rights movement? All right, and so rules and advice for this project, you must watch the films below. So for this project, you're going to explore the popular memory of the civil rights movement, try to figure out what are the key themes by watching 10 different films, popular films about the civil rights movement. This is the only project where you might have to spend some of your own money, but there are ways to request these films through either Texas Tech or your local public library to avoid spending your own money. And I've also tried on this list to choose films that are either available on YouTube or on a popular streaming service like Hulu or Netflix. Not all of them are available on YouTube or a streaming service, but I've tried hard to create a list where a lot of them are. And so you can see this list here. It's a list of 10 films. You need to watch all 10 to do this project. And if there's a film on here that you want to watch, like the Spike Lee's recent film, The Black Klansman or something like that, you want to go to the theater, watch that, and add that to the list, perfectly okay. But you can't substitute a film for one of the films that are here. These films, all the films you have to watch that are on this particular list, okay? Project 3. Same question, what are the key themes of the popular memory of the civil rights movement, but a different set of sources, okay? And so for this project, you have the choice to explore this question through the annual commemorations of Martin Luther King's assassination. So basically every every April, when Martin Luther King was assassinated in early April 1968, every April since then, there are tons of articles on that commemorate his assassination. And generally, a lot of these articles talk about what the civil rights movement was about. So it's kind of an opportunity every April that we see where people are really remembering the civil rights movement. And so it's really an opportunity to look at the popular memory of the civil rights movement through the memory of the commemoration of King's assassination. And so again, a good place to start I have on here is that same newspaper database that I just showed you with Steinberg. And so this link right here takes you to that same list of newspaper databases where you can start your research, and then we can expand the set of sources from there. Okay, Project 4 comes from a research question that's in Beth Bailey's book, America's Army. And so the question is, did the Army change the way it portrayed African Americans and women in recruiting advertisements in the 1970s and 1980s? And so this has a lot of flexibility for the sources you're going to use. Generally, we're looking for advertisement. That's what's going to be available for us. Without actually having to travel to Washington, D.C. to an archive, or to Carlisle, Pennsylvania to an archive, what's going to be available to us on the internet. And so we're looking for advertisements, magazine and newspaper ads, commercials, pamphlets that we can find through our newspaper databases or through some other open access databases that are on the internet. So I've provided a link here to the Google Magazine archive that I showed you how to use above. And so if you're interested in this, one thing that I would look for when you go into the Google Magazine archive is there are a lot of magazines there that are magazines targeted either at African Americans or at women. And that would be a good place to start. Like we have Jet Magazine, we have Ebony Magazine. Good places to start just doing some research and looking through those magazines, because those magazines have tons of ads in them, and the Army buys ad space in those magazines. So those are the sorts of things that we're going to start looking for to start that research. Project 5 also is a research question that comes out of Beth Bailey's book on the Army. And so the question is, since the inception of the all-volunteer Army, has the Army's peacetime recruiting tactics differed from the Army's recruiting tactics during wartime? Okay, so again, this offers a wide range of possible sources, but one of the main sources will be recruiting advertisements. And so again, that Google Magazine archive will be good. I have a link here to the library newspaper databases, both good places to start some research, and we can expand out from there. All right, Project 6 goes to Morton's book, which we just read. And so the question is, did pro-corporate populism that she talks about in that book that emerged to support Walmart actually originate in the Ozarks, right? And so one of Morton's arguments is this, she says it's kind of a unique corporate populism that emerges in the Ozarks region and then kind of expands nationally. And so this project allows us to question whether it really did originate in that region, or whether you can find that in other regions throughout the country. If you can find that in other regions around the country before or around the time that Morton sees it developing in the Ozarks, then we can actually contest one of Morton's arguments here. Okay, and so again, the library's newspaper databases are a good place to start that research, and then we can expand from there. Another place we might want to start is kind of looking at some of the writings of national religious figures during this time, like Billy Graham's writings, and Texas Tech's library has some of those early writings that you can check out if you're in Lubbock, or if you're a distant student, you can actually request that Texas Tech's library actually send you the book in the mail. If you have any questions about that, I'm happy to show you how to do that. All right, last potential project that you can choose from, I think, is a fun one. Morton makes a lot of claims about country music and how it supports this sort of pro-corporate populism that emerges in the 1970s. And so the question is, did corporate music support pro-corporate populism that emerged in the 1970s? Right? And so this is kind of a fun project because you can listen to a lot of country music. But remember, since this is questions about the 1970s, you need to dive into the music of the 1970s. And you can continue to explore the question in the 1980s and 1990s, but you have to go back at least as far as the 1970s to answer this question adequately. And so my advice here is a good place to start searching for artists and songs is just to go back to the Billboard charts for country music from each year of the 1970s. And there you can start to figure out who are the really popular artists of the period. And Spotify, again, if you don't know what that is, I'm happy to provide some links for you. But Spotify would be a great place to start listening to these artists, and they'll give you access to their full albums, right, from the decade. And so as a goal here, I would want you to use at least 30 songs and 10 different musicians or groups in your paper. And obviously you can use a lot more than that, but you need to use at least 30 songs and 10 different musicians and groups. And so I've tried really hard to provide a wide range of options here that will spark different people's interests. One of the reasons why I'm limiting you to these 7 projects is because I want you to pursue a project where I know the sources are available for you to complete the project. And it's a research question that you can actually answer in a semester. The problem with just opening it up is that, when I first started teaching, I used to just say, any project that relates to post-1945 U.S. history is fair game. Go out and find your own project. What would generally happen is 2 or 3 people would come up with a good research question with the sources that are readily available to be able to complete, and everyone else wouldn't be able to do that, and we would just be scrambling at the end to find a project that would actually work. And so it might sound easy to you to come up with a research question, but most people don't understand what sorts of questions that we can actually pursue with the sources that are available to us, especially in a distance class. And so that's the reason why I'm kind of limiting us to these 7 projects, because I don't want you to go far off base and then scramble to the end to find a project that's actually viable. One last thing, come back down to the questions about that relate to Morton's book. This sort of pro-corporate populism, if you're going to do one of those, either Project 6 or Project 7, it's really important that you know what pro-corporate populism means. And probably about 70% of you got this in your reading response, but about 30 to 40% didn't. And so I just want to point out one of the places where she talks about this. Okay, and so if you're going to do this project, you need to reread probably the first few chapters of that book where she really lays out pro-corporate populism. A lot of you did a really good job with this, but the one thing that even for the people who did a really great job with this missed really important component of pro-corporate populism. This is on page 31 at the top, and so I want to point out here, I'm going to underline the most important part of this. For her, the most important part of pro-corporate populism is this combination of government subsidy and anti-government politics, okay? And so what she's basically saying here is, in the Ozarks, people like Sam Walton and others were able to convince the people there to be comfortable and support big government subsidies for corporations and at the very same time still have these anti-government politics, and they somehow kind of merge them together. Okay, so that's a really important part. It's not the only part of corporate populism, but it's one of the fundamental parts. And I just don't want you to miss this if you're going to pursue this project. Obviously, there are the different religious components, etc., that a number of you did a really good job outlining. But this piece here on page 31 is a piece that most of you missed. And so if you're going to pursue one of those projects, just go back and reread those early chapters where she lays out exactly what corporate populism means and what it looked like in the Ozarks, so we can really test her arguments in our research. Okay, and so for the reading response this week, all I'm asking you to do is just tell me which project that you want to pursue. And I'm also going to ask you, if you search through any of these databases, did you run into any problems? Do you want advice doing particular things? Because next week we're going to do some more targeted research, and I'm going to walk you through, go back through these databases again, and I want to be able to answer any questions or address any problems that some of you might have had when you're kind of experimenting with these databases, so we can make sure that everybody's on the right track and has the tools to be able to complete some more research next week. And so even if you're doing something like the civil rights projects that doesn't force you into the databases, one thing that I would suggest doing is just click on one of those databases and do a little bit of searching so you can get familiar with them, because even for someone who's doing the film project, those databases still might actually be useful for you too. And so I want you to get a little bit of experience there. Okay, and so again, take a look at these projects, and again, I'm going to ask you which one that you want to do. You don't have to make a firm commitment to it. If you say you were going to do project 1 and next week you decide, well, actually I want to do project 2, you're not locked in any way. Okay, but I do want you to just do some thinking about it and tell me which one is most attractive to you. And if next week, when we start getting into some targeted research, you change your mind, it's fine then to do the assignment on another project. That's perfectly fine to me, but just let me know that you're now pursuing a different project if you decide to do that next week. All right. So again, if there are any questions that you have as you start looking through these projects, that's perfectly fine. Obviously, the paper outline is not going to be available yet because we're pretty far away from actually starting to write the paper. The first thing that we're going to do is the research prospectus, and that all of those directions will be available starting next week. I really just want you to just think about what project you want to do, and we'll move on from there. All right. Email me with any questions. Happy to set up a Skype or a phone call if you want to talk. All right. Have a great week.